how did you first get involved with this book project? Around 12 years ago, one of the editors, Mark Blasius, who had been an exchange professor in UP Diliman, invited me to contribute to this Philippine LGBT Studies anthology that he was editing. At the time, it had no working title yet and no publisher. Of course, I agreed to help out. This was a book that had long been overdue. It was clear to me then that there needed to be a primary resource for gender and sexuality studies in our country, especially as framed from an anti-heteronormative perspective. Is it important to recognize native labels and identities like bakla or tomboy along with Western terms like gay, lesbian, trans, etc.? If we have to talk about Philippine gender and sexuality, by necessity we begin with the gendered self-understandings, the actual categories and names that operate in the everyday lives of Filipinos. While the terms L, G, and B, and T are circulating in certain domains in our country, these domains are mostly the Anglophone ones. For instance, among academic communities in the big cities, or in activist circles that traffic in SOGI SC, discourse, and politics. One of our primary responsibilities as critics and scholars is to be self-reflexive, meaning to be conscious of our own presuppositions when we carry out our work in cultural interpretation. An important part of what this means is that we must be more acutely aware of the translation that we are enacting each and every time we render these local terms for different gender identities into their supposedly Anglophone equivalents. Allow me to emphasize the word supposedly here, because even or precisely in the practice of translation, equivalence is and can only be an illusion, a fantasy that the translator can choose to either dissimulate or visibly flag. More and more, I am of the persuasion that Anglophone critics and scholars need to foreignize rather than domesticate their deployment of English in their writings. This way, the cultural difference that they are trying to surface and understand will be announced and made visible right at the outset, for the medium of analysis will register it in its very structure and form. How much would you say the interaction between cultures in the Philippines has affected the way LGBT people have lived over the centuries? Gender and sexuality are historical categories, and as such they are overdetermined by discourses and political enforcements across localities and temporalities. Of course, the ways contemporary gender and sexual self-understandings exist and function among Filipinos now are the interlingual and or transcultural result of such processes. What this implies is that, as I previously explained, the presence of Anglophone words in our country's present-day inventory of gender and sexual identities cannot be taken at face value and must be appreciated more complexly, for they most likely are understood translationally by the Filipinos who use them. As translations, these words must be contextualized socially and historically, for despite their seemingly easy Anglophonic intelligibility, they continue to bear traces of the histories of traditional models of gender and sexuality that the arrival of new knowledges and languages into our country did not completely extinguish or displace. What are some of the particular issues and circumstances facing Filipino LGBTQs in culture today? Of course, like everyone else, Filipino sexual minorities are needing to cope with the difficulties and restrictions that have been brought about by the current global health crisis. Because Filipino LGBTQs come from a diversity of backgrounds, and because their experiences of inequality have been various and multiple and intersectional, each LGBTQ person will have their own individual or unique sets of circumstances or issues to grapple with, but also their own individual support systems and coping mechanisms to seek solace in or draw strength from. More than 2 decades since it was first filed in the Philippine Congress, the National Anti-Discrimination Bill has yet to be passed. even as across the same period we have seen ordinances and statutes that penalize discriminatory acts on the basis of SOGSC becoming enacted in more and more local government units like cities and provinces. What are some of the differences now in how Filipino LGBTQs are viewed and how they view themselves compared to in the past? In answering this question, I'd like to broach and reflect on the word queer, a word that would seem not to have been terribly crucial when the editors were conceptualizing this book, but which has since gained traction globally and become more important in our context as well, including, if not especially, in the field of gender and sexuality studies. We begin with the realization that within the activist and academic discourses of contemporary Anglophonic globality, more and more queer is functioning as the shorthand for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and other extra-normative identities and sexualities. A refunction pejorative, its provenance in the West, particularly in the US, includes its deployment in the AIDS/HIV activist movement in the 1990s, when this disease was entirely lethal, although during the same period it was also being invoked in critical theory circles as a post-foundational category that gestured towards but also profoundly troubled both conventional and progressive understandings of gender, sexuality, identity, subjectivity, and political action. Its currency in the Philippines is mostly confined to urban-centered activist and academic communities, although among the country's Anglophone youth cultures, which enjoy global connectivity through IT gadgets like smartphones, it is being used more and more as a form of self-identification that bespeaks an openness to complexity as far as gender and sexual identities are concerned. It's important to say that, as with the other earlier Anglophone categories like gay, lesbian, and bisexual, queer too, as it is circulating in the Philippines, linguistically dynamic, culturally simultaneous, and unevenly Anglophone world, is understood mostly translationally, subsuming, syncretizing, but not entirely superseding earlier and even more traditional concepts of gendered personhood and sexual desire. This perhaps constitutes this increasingly crucial word's greater relevancy here and in other Anglophonic contexts. As a verb, queer after all signifies reflexivity, self-irony, and autocritique, which makes it entirely open to the idea and the practice of becoming itself deconstructed, critically interrogated, and refunctioned. Needless to say, queered, in this case through the transformative process of translation, anywhere and everywhere it may be found. What is the value of a book like this today? It's unfortunate that this anthology has taken so long to put out. As my previous comments on the local salience of the word queer makes clear, over the last decade, so much has transpired in our culture's gender and sexual social histories, as these have been shaped and reshaped, challenged and sustained by such globally transformative forces as digitality and the formations and deformations of late capital. Nonetheless, even as this book may have been overtaken by recent events, it does serve as a kind of baseline source for any student wishing to carry out work in contemporary gender and sexuality studies in the Philippines. Because this book exists, no student wishing to do the kind of work that we do will need to suffer the same kind of fate that I, for example, had needed to endure early in my career as a researcher, confronted as I was by the terrifying paucity and sheer disorganization of sources and materials on the topic. Of course, local activists should also find this book useful, as it does clarify the kinds of political labor and social interventions that need to be imagined and performed in addressing the intersectional problem of gender and sexual inequality among our people. Please talk about your article. What is it about? My article in this anthology forms the ultimate chapter of the reissued edition of my book, Philippine Gay Culture, first published by the University of the Philippines Press in 1996 and republished by the UP Press in 2008 and by the Hong Kong University Press in 2009 as part of its Queer Asia series. I wrote it as an update on the empirical survey of Philippine gay cultural events and foundational concepts from the original work, and also as a way to resituate this work's significance from within a decolonial frame. When the UP Press decided to reissue this book as part of its UP Centennial titles, I decided that in the new edition I would need to put together a more self-consciously post-colonial approach to the study of Philippine gender and sexuality as focalized around the issues and questions of Filipino gay subjectivity. What emerged in this engagement with my old work was my theorizing of what I am now inclined to call a critical nationalist perspective. To my mind, while politically invested in the concept as well as in the reality of the Filipino nation, critical nationalism is entirely wary of institutional nationalism and criticizes it for its many excesses. Among other things, it recognizes the fact that this discourse is produced and championed by our country's elite, whose interest it serves and whose bourgeois and heteronormative narrative it tells, at the expense of subaltern narratives coming from marginalized subjects. Also, critical nationalism is careful to avoid the myth-making tendencies of any institutional nativist project that seeks to recuperate a lost pre-colonial identity, for what likely underwrites such an undertaking is a covert and persistent, needless to say, colonial desire to be affirmed by the center, whose attention and approval it continues to seek. Finally, critical nationalism situates the issue of cultural production within unequal macro relations, which themselves constitute a specific modality of an expansionist, now unctuously called global capitalism. Needless to say, the salience of the class question alongside other questions of inequality remains integral to the critique that critical nationalist accounts must offer. With this update and autocritique, I hoped to gesture toward generative contact zones between post-colonialism or even decolonialism and the kinds of anti-heteronormative interpretive work that the various chapters in this book are seeking to embody and represent. Other scholars will hopefully find this line of inquiry provocative and pursue its difficult but entirely necessary questions on their own.